Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming out. I'm so honored to be talking with Jessie Daniels about her wonderful book, Nice White Ladies. Something that Jessie and she's a professor here, and she can tell you a little bit more about herself in a moment. But something that we have in common is that we've both taken really seriously the mandate for white people to talk to each other about the problem of white supremacy. And so I'm just really excited to speak with her tonight. And did you want to start out by talking a little bit about the book and then maybe read a little bit?
Sure. So welcome everybody, and thank you so much for coming out tonight. It's so wonderful to be in this space. Thank you to President Rob and Hunter College and Basil Smelke for hosting us here at the Roosevelt House. And I too am so honored to be in conversation with Maud Newton. Her book came out earlier this year called Ancestor Trouble, which is just such a powerful story of her own family. And there's so many things. Part of the reason I want to be in conversation with Maud is because we have so many things in common and so many, I don't know, just there's just so much overlap between the two of us. So I'm just thrilled. So thank you so much for coming out tonight. And I think I'm just going to start by reading a little bit in the book, and then we can take the conversation from there. Is that all right?
Sounds great.
Okay. So this is just from the opening, just to give you a sense of where I'm going with this book. Nice white ladies and our protection are fundamental to American culture, and this fact is destroying all of us. You should know that I myself am a white woman. I've been helped in my career by many nice white ladies, some of them feminists. I come from a long line of white women ancestors, none of whom would have ever identified as a feminist. When I enter a room, people assume I'm a nice white lady. No one can tell just by looking at me that I have spent half my life in a conscious effort to not be a nice white lady. I have learned to disavow the niceness that is a cover for ignoring the pain of others, to distance myself from the safe emptiness of whiteness, and to detox from the poison of ladyhood. Yet, this is what the women in my family hoped for. For me, this narrow dream of nice white ladyhood. The other thing that you should know about these women I come from, my ancestors in Texas, is that none of them made it past the 8th grade in school. All of them were married by the time they were 15 years old, and as a point of pride, they would have me tell you not one of those was a shotgun wedding. All of the women I come from were mothers by the time they were 16 years old. Not me. I went after as much education as the state of Texas had on offer, divorced a couple of husbands along the way without having children, and found myself in a clutch of radical lesbian feminists. Along the way, I discovered that I was white. My father had told me I was Cherokee. I didn't fully realize I was white until fairly late in life, in my 20s, when I started reading books by people who were actually indigenous, who pointed out how very common it is for white people to claim Cherokee ancestry when there was none. When I would ask my mother, "What are we?" she seemed less interested in ethnic heritage than my father and would dismiss my questions with a quick, "Scotch-Irish, I think." She did not entertain follow-up questions. "Go play outside" was her most common response to my inquiries, genealogical or otherwise. In a family photo from 1962, I'm a baby held in my great-grandmother's arms. She wears a dress with a floral print, a belt cinched snug under her bosom, wireframe glasses, gray hair swept back in a bun, sensible shoes that lace up the front. What you cannot see in this photo is the tin she carries, a repurposed Vienna sausage can that she uses to spit out chewing tobacco. My cousins and I call her Little Granny because she was quite short and continued to shrink as she aged. It was a rite of passage for each of us 11 cousins to mark the point at which we grew taller than Little Granny. Next to her in the photo is my grandmother, Big Granny, don't laugh, because she is taller than her mother by a couple of inches. She is a stout woman, funny sometimes, and mean. In the photo, she wears moderately high heels and a dress cut the same as little Granny's, but in a geometric print. The dresses are so similar, I suspect that they are homemade by one of them, both expert seamstresses. Next to Big Granny in the photo is my mother, the tallest by several inches, slim and chic in dark sunglasses, shorts, and a shirt with giant polka dots and matching sandals. I do not know the particular details of when the photo was taken or what prompted this self-conscious documentation of 4 generations of our family, but I think about this photo often. I sometimes use it when I give talks about white women and white feminism because it so clearly locates me at the end of this line of white women who raised me, and it makes me think about how very different my life is from theirs.
There are so many things we have in common in our families, and so I think like your book, like my book, your book does a little bit of a back and forth between your own history and your deep research, and so I thought maybe we could talk a little bit about as a starting point. This idea of pretendians that you talk about in your book and that you read a little bit about here.
Yeah, so there's this idea that you may or may not have heard of people who are pretendians. That is, they pretend to be Native American. And this was part of my father's narrative about himself. And he definitely grew up identifying as Cherokee specifically and Native American. When I was, another story that I tell in the book about my father is that I learned about the Trail of Tears from my father. He told the story about the Trail of Tears as if our ancestors were on that forced march from Georgia to Oklahoma. There's no truth to that. And I'm not exactly sure how he came up with that story, except that it's a very quintessential American story, this idea of claiming Native heritage when there is no evidence of it. And part of what I learned in doing genealogical research for this, for a memoir that I'm working on in several other tabs, was the story of the actual story of my family, which is that my great-grandfather, so if you're sketching this at home, this is my father's grandfather, and he was among those white settlers who made the run into Oklahoma. Now, this is also a story that I heard growing up, right, about settling Oklahoma, which was Native American land, which had been repurposed by the US government for the purpose of housing white settlers. And so in my family, in 3 generations on my father's side, they went from taking Native American land at the behest of the US government to my grandfather, who we can talk about a little bit if you want, to my father claiming that he is Native American. And there is something about that I think is really quintessential in the American experience, because what it does is it moves people who claim that identity to a kind of ownership of the land. Like, we really belong here because we're Native. And so I think that was part of what he was doing, but I also think that he was looking for, in academic circles we would say alterity. He was looking for otherness. He was looking for a way out of his lineage, of his grandfather, father, and the rest. And I think that was a way that he did that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think, one thing that you do really well in this book is to simultaneously show how whiteness is in our culture a desirable thing, a thing that comes with privilege, often with wealth, with power, and also essentially a contentless thing, a sad thing, a cloak that doesn't really mean anything in particular, as we can see as we look back in history and are able to track the expansion of this invented category of whiteness, which de-individuates while subsuming. And so, the book is about nice white ladies, so maybe we should kind of head in that way and then get into some of our other family histories through that. And so, you know, we're all aware of the Karens phenomenon, of course, Amy Cooper, and, you know, the calling of the cops on a man who was watching birds in Central Park. And Patricia, wasn't McCloskey, in her capri pants wielding her pistol at marchers in St. Louis. And so, yeah, I thought maybe you could break this down for everybody. How you think that this weaponization has occurred, you know, historically, and why we're in this moment we are now.
Yeah, so I think that, I mean, the book's doing several things, and one of the things, and part of the reason that I called it Nice White Ladies, as I say in the introduction, is that I was really trying to disrupt each one of these categories, what it means to be nice, what it means to be white, what it means to be a lady. And I think in a lot of ways we've done a lot, in part because of the feminist movement, we've done a lot to disrupt what it means to be a lady. In fact, one of the early pushbacks I got on the book was, what's all this lady talk? Like, nobody talks about women that way anymore. I was like, it's still kind of a thing. And we may not say she's not being a nice lady anymore, or we might, but it is still a kind of standard that we have about the way that women should behave in society. And I think that there is a particular kind of identity and category of personhood, in academia we would say a subjectivity, that is created by the combination of those three identities, of being nice, of being white, of being a lady. And that, part of what I'm arguing in the book is that identity, that subject position, if you will, it does things in the culture. And so historically, this goes back, I take it back to, you know, the practice of colonialism, and there were, you know, and we can thank the British for this in many ways, but there were ways in which when British colonizers went to other countries and took them over to capture people or resources or whatever, part of what they said that they were doing was that they were making civilization so that it was acceptable for white women in the colonial experience. And in fact, that got codified into laws where in one particular country that was colonized by the British, they had a law that said if a colonized person attacked a white woman, there was a special penalty for that. Like, that was extra punishment because we're here to protect white women. And I trace that kind of to the present moment with the 911 system, which is really the kind of operationalization, in a way, of that protection of white women. And there's a history behind that, but I think that the important point to realize is that if I were to call 911 right now, the police, whoever the dispatcher was on the other end, would believe me at the beginning of that call, just at the jump. They would hear my voice, they would assume whiteness, and they would believe me. And they would come to do something that they perceived as protecting me. And that is a particular subject position in this society, and not everyone has access to that. And when I call 911, I'm actually raining down a kind of violence and death on another person. So to me, it seems to me that white women as a category do this really important work that's ultimately very destructive to society, which is partly through our niceness. We smooth over the sort of sharp edges of these oppressive systems. And not only through our niceness, but also through our roles as wives and mothers, you know, to sort of reproduce the next generation of people who will sustain this oppressive system.
Yeah. And one thing that I admire about the book is the way that you show how this extends across class. So a little bit of personal history from me. On my father's side, my father was from the Mississippi Delta, and he was an overt white supremacist who defended slavery. And so that side of my family was... no one else on that side of the family was quite as outspoken about it as he was, but the vibe was very white-centric, very, very solidly middle class with an aspiration to move higher. And our ancestors, I knew through my father's pride, had enslaved Black people in the Mississippi Delta. On my mother's side, my grandmother, like your people in Texas, was very poor. And I had seen this photo of an emaciated horse that my sister, or rather my grandmother and her sister and grandfather were riding behind. And my grandmother, had worked her whole life and saved money. And so there was this whole, very standard mythology that we all hear about the working class white person who pulls themselves up out of poverty. And there were, part of her family, everybody would gather with tin cans and spit tobacco into them. This was before my time, but so this is one of the ways I felt a lot of kinship with your book. But at the same time, as was the case in your family, there was a clear aspiration to move up and a clear sense of what the appropriate work was for a white woman. For my grandmother, my granny, she was also my granny, didn't like the term lady, but even so, that was what she wanted for me to be a lady. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that in your family.
Yeah, I mean, so much to say about that. There was definitely so part of what I talk about in the book, and this I want to just shout out my friend and colleague, Natasha Stovall. She has this beautiful article called Whiteness on the Couch, and she's a psychoanalyst and also a beautiful writer. And part of what she talks about is what kind of whiteness are we talking about? And she does a whole riff that's like, do you mean Cracker Barrel white or farm to table white? Which is a beautiful way, right, of sort of getting at class, right? And what Bourdieu would call distinctions, right? And part of my riff on that is, well, do you mean Martha Stewart white? Or do you mean Paula Deen white? And it's a similar kind of thing. And in my family, I mean, part of what I think my background's in sociology, I think we don't talk about enough in sociology is my parents had two different class backgrounds. And so when someone asked me what my class background was, it's like, well, complicated, it was mixed. So my father was pretty solidly middle class, went to the University of Texas. Actually, his father also went to college, as did my grandmother on that side. But he didn't finish at University of Houston out of some fight he had with a professor that he got pissed off at. And so I became a professor. Anyway, that's a subject for another book. But my mother was very, very poor. Her people had come from Central Texas. If you've ever been to Hill Country Barbecue here in New York, my mother's from that place where that barbecue is from. But they were super poor, and like when people talk about dirt farmers, they were dirt farmers, like trying to scratch a living out of the ground in Central Texas. And if you've ever read Robert Cairo's beautiful Path to Power, he has a quite famous chapter called The Sad Irons about what it was like for women living in Central Texas. And that chapter really captures what it was like for I think for my mother's side of the family. So when she married my father, it was a second marriage for both of them. But when she married my father, it was a class aspiration that led her to that marriage, right? And what I feel like is the kind of con of that sort of class aspiration for women, for white women especially, is that then she was kind of trapped as a suburban housewife, right? She was in a household, keeping the house clean and raising me, and that was all she did. She never worked again after I was born. And I feel like that was a particular kind of, bill of goods that she was sold about her class aspiration, because it wasn't tied to her work or effort, or it was really tied to the relationship that she had with my father. And so it boxed her in a particular way, right? Like she was economically dependent on him and do things for herself. And I think that that kind of class distinction, even within families, makes a difference about the kinds of stories that we tell about whiteness. So just one more thing on that. When I was growing up, I went to visit my big granny in Galena Park, Texas. And the people that lived across the street from her, even as poor as they were, having moved from central Texas to this little town outside of Houston, even as poor as they were, my grandfather drove a short-haul truck. My grandmother worked at a five and dime. But they made sure to make a distinction between the people that lived across the street from them because they were white trash. And I, was curious and a little kid, and I went over there and it was, just telling myself here, was appalled at how dirty their house was. And then didn't go back over to play with them anymore. But that was my mother's gift to me, if you will, as messed up as that is, about class and being a nice white lady is you keep a clean house, right? I mean, that's baked into nice white ladyhood as being, your first responsibility is to the house.
But then she didn't want you to be the one who would clean the house because your destiny, unlike hers, was to be a lady who could hire someone else, presumably a Black person, to clean the house.
And that was a very explicit conversation that my mother and I had, because I would, little kid, ask my mother, how do I do the thing that you're doing? And she categorically refused to teach me any kind of housework. She's like, nope, this is not for you. You will not do this. So when I say it was a thing I inherited, it was very much internalized and sort of subconscious. But explicitly, she would do things like say, like growing up in Corpus Christi, Texas, I had to do tennis lessons at noon in July. I, to this day, can't stand tennis. Or outdoor sports. Anyway, but part of the reason for that was because in my mother's imagination, I was going to find a nice man at a country club, and I would need to know how to play tennis for that life, right? I mean, it was a whole picture she had painted. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I related a lot to that sort of vibe around your destiny, in the eyes of your mom and, to some extent your dad. So as you know, and I write about this in my book, I had divided my family without fully realizing it into the racist side and the not racist side, or, well, maybe not fundamentally racist side, right? And, I didn't realize how much I had invested in this idea of a side of my family that was not implicated in slavery until I found ancestors on my grandmother's side who had also enslaved Black people. And not only had they enslaved Black people, they had sued each other over who had the right to enslave these people. And that was an absolute gut punch, but really important because I could see how, despite my sense of myself as someone who was really willing to acknowledge these histories, I had created a similar sort of structure in my own mind to the kind of excuses that I often saw operating for other people around their families. And when I looked back at my family, I remembered my grandmother talking about certain work as N-word work. And it was one of those things that nice white ladies do, a kind of amnesia, a slamming down on that memory. And when it came back, I realized, oh, this was here for me to see all along. And I want to also talk about your dad and the role that men play in this construction of nice white ladies. And so, I mean, there's so much to talk about there, but one thing I thought was really interesting, and we probably should have given a content warning at the beginning of this talk. There will be a discussion of sexual abuse and suicide attempts and suicide successes, and so I just wanted to let you all know. But so, when you spoke to your dad about the fact that your grandfather had sexually abused you, he was very sympathetic and he recognized that as abuse. But then when you spoke to your dad about your grandfather's history in the Klan, he did not recognize that as abuse. And so I wondered if you could talk about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I sort of skipped over my grandfather, who was both a child molester and a member of the Klan, which once you start investigating this, actually comes up a lot, that these two things are connected. And I actually wrote about this in the preface to my first academic book called White Lies. And in that preface, I talked about the fact that connection between white supremacy and claiming the body of children as sex objects is connected in the sense that it's a form of entitlement. It's the same impulse behind settler colonialism. It's the same impulse that my great-grandfather had when he saw Oklahoma. Like, I don't care that Native Americans are living here. I'm going to take this, right? And the U.S. government agreed with him. But I think that my father's response, and the way that I found out, I should say, I had always known that my grandfather had molested me when I was a very young child, 4 or 5, and he carried that memory with me my whole life. And I had gone to graduate school at the University of Texas at Austin, and I was years into a dissertation on the Klan, and my father knew this, and we took a family trip to visit a relative in Missouri, my Aunt Marie. And while we were at Aunt Marie's, she had a bookshelf. Not everyone in my family did. She had a bookshelf, and I saw on the shelf a copy of Thomas Dixon's The Klansman, spelled with a C. And I pulled that book off the shelf, and I was like, Aunt Marie, why do you have this book? And she, like, I don't know. She said, I think it was your grandfather. So that's her brother's. Okay, so it's my great aunt. And I opened the flyleaf of the book, and I saw his name and his handwriting in the book, and I was like, well, why did he have it? And she said, oh, he was in that group. And she turned around and went back into the kitchen where she was cooking dinner. And my father, who was reading the newspaper, just kind of, I was like, did you know this? And he sort of was reading the paper, he shook the paper, he was like, yeah, it's no big deal. I was like, what? What? Excuse me, what do you mean no big deal? And he was like, yeah, it was just how did he put it? It was just a group, they were trying to help people. I was like, help people? What do you mean by that? And he said, well, if a guy was beating up his wife, they would go around and pay him a visit. I was like, okay, because there's a kind of violence implied in that, but he seemed not bothered by that. I said, yeah, but that wasn't all that they did. He said, yeah, once he figured out they were into all this other stuff, he didn't, he got out of the group or whatever. But he never saw it as certainly never saw it as abuse. He never saw his insistence that I, show my grandfather love and respect was ever a form of abuse. He just really minimized it. And as I have done this work, most of my work to this point has been about the far right. And as I've done this work on the far right, I cannot tell you, I have lost count of the number of white people who come up to me after a talk when I'm presenting on my work on the far right and will say, my grandfather was in the Klan too. And I'm like, right, there were around 4 million. So there are lots of us, right, who have these ancestors. And I just think there needs to be more than just you and I who are doing the reckoning with this, right? There needs to be, I think, in some ways, I think of our two books as doing a similar kind of thing, which is, okay, here's our family, and we've done all this work, and here's how this went. Now it's your turn. Like, tell us about your family.
I mean, I do feel really, I have a very strong sense that one of the ways, so I think, in this moment we're in where these states are outlawing discussions of historical fact, right? You're not allowed to talk about slavery now. You're not allowed to talk about the persecution and genocide of indigenous people, because that might offend someone, by which they mean a white person, right? And so I think there's a tendency among people like nice white ladies on the left to say, oh, well, what can we do? I mean, they're not letting us talk about it, and to sort of want to lecture everyone about these histories. And lecturing everyone about the histories is appropriate, but the most intimate and the most fundamental relationship that people like me and so many white people in this country have to those histories is through our own families. And it also becomes a different kind of conversation to a resistant person, right? When you're saying, my ancestors did this, and here's how I feel about that, and here's what I view as my responsibility as a result of that, and here are the ways that I'm open to understanding more about my responsibility. I'm not saying that that's going to change the minds of, somebody in a Make America Great Again hat, but it might change the minds of people who are a little more wishy-washy, like your aunt who turned around and went back into the kitchen, right? And I think, another thing that you really get at in the book that is so important is that not only is this culture so toxic for Black people, Indigenous people, Latino people, for everyone who doesn't fall within this category of whiteness, right? It's toxic for white people as well. And, I was really struck, something else we have in common is that my mother tried to kill herself, and she did not succeed. And your mother tried to kill herself.
And she did. She ended her own life in 1983. She was 48 years old, and I was 21. And I thought I was all grown up, but that's a very young age to lose your mother, which I understand now. But part of what, and I've been in therapy for years around that, and if you have someone in your life who took their own life, you too should be in therapy. Just because there's a high incidence of collateral damage from that, right? Not that you would also take your life, but you also, there's a blowback from that. It's really painful. And for a lot of years, including in therapy, I talked with therapists about how part of her death was because I mentioned in the opening that Big Granny was mean, and part of her meanness came out towards my mother. She was the middle of 3 children, and for reasons that are lost to history, she was scapegoated among those 3. And so she, while they went to school, she was made to stay home and clean the house and beaten until she bled and stuff like that. So there were certainly personal things that happened to my mother that created a kind of psychological profile that led her to that. But I also spent a lot of time thinking about her life in terms of these, social categories and the structural elements that we talk about in sociology. So for many years, I understood her death as, and kind of immediately after her death, I took my first women's studies class, I think the summer after my mother died, and it was a revelation. I mean, I was just like, oh my God, it's all about gender, and kind of became a feminist after that. and understood the way that her life had been constrained by gender in various ways. But it was only in the last 10 or so years that I started thinking about the way that her life had been constrained because of whiteness. I mentioned that, she lived in a suburban, house, and that kind of isolation of a suburban household, where she is the one who's responsible for that house, and she mainly stayed home and took care of that house and didn't interact with the rest of the world. I mean, she saw that as her prize, as really like the accomplishment of her life, that she had found my father and married him, and and got this kind of win of being a suburban housewife that didn't have to work. But I think that also had a kind of corrosive effect on her, that sort of, and we know there's lots of literature now on the kind of the damage that isolation does, right? But the other thing just to bring it back to right now and out of my family, right now we're dealing with one of the first ever dips in mortality, right? Those statistics on life expectancy are actually going down now for the first time. And there's a thing that my colleagues in public health or epidemiologists call an epidemiological mystery, which is that for women ages, I get the age group right, 49 to 65, so just a little bit older than my mother was when she ended her life, that there is a huge spike in early deaths of white women in that category. So 49 to 65 white women, incredibly high rates of suicide for that group. And epidemiologists are like, we can't understand this. And I was like, I have a partial explanation, which is that there is a way that we as nice white ladies in this culture are at the sort of peak of our value in the culture before we reach 48 or 49, right? And you hear this in other ways. You've heard this story in other ways, where you'll hear older white women say, I used to get catcalled on the street and now I'm invisible. Like I could be an undercover agent now because no one sees me, right? Because I'm of a certain age, right? And I think that there is a way in which that dip in our value speaks directly to the nice white ladiness of our subject position, right? And when that value declines, there are all kinds of ways that people have for finding comfort, to self-soothe, and that's drugs, that's alcohol, and sometimes it ends in premature death.
And you write too about the ways that the wellness industry has a tendency to, particularly among white women, to create this sort of, well, I just have to focus on myself, I just have to improve myself, I just have to work at being happy for myself, rather than looking at the larger systemic issues, our medical system, our food production system.
Yeah. There are all kinds of ways that the wellness industry really, in some ways, is like a barometer on this dis-ease I feel that we have as nice white ladies. It's a billion-dollar business, wellness, and you don't have to just look at Gwyneth Paltrow's Goop, although that's an excellent example. But there are lots of other ways that we, as white women, have driven this wellness industry. But, like you were saying in the question, it's so individualized, and part of what we're invited to do, and I've, participated in many of these modalities, but part of what we're invited to do when you enter one of these healing spaces is to put everything unpleasant outside the room, right? And in that bucket goes everything from, racism and white supremacy to economic inequality, or why I might actually feel this bad in the first place, right? And I really do think that there's something about whiteness that is corrosive in a kind of trauma and that's part of what's driving the wellness industry, is because we do feel something is not right, and so we keep looking for whatever that is, but we keep falling into the grift, that we're sold as white women, from this culture, which is, if you get a good man, then you're going to be okay, or if you get the right yoga class, then you're going to be okay, and it's not the case. I mean, part of what's driving this dis-ease is that we live in a society in which, people are profiting off the death of others. And if we keep looking away, then that's not going to stop.
Yeah, and one thing that I think, it might seem like an extreme example, but I think one thing that underscores this sort of position that white women are in is how your father reacted when you showed him part of your thesis that you were working on. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So I mentioned the preface to White Lies, which is my first academic book, and I was very proud of that piece of writing, and because it had some memoir stuff in it. There was this dream sequence in it. Anyway, I was very pleased with that. And I sent it off to my father, and I thought that he was going to say, "Gold star, baby, you did great." And in that preface, I also talked about my grandfather and the fact that he molested me and he was a member of the Klan and all that kind of stuff. And my father, instead of saying, "Great job," I was between academic positions at the time and staying with my brother in Houston, which is where my family was at the time. And my father found a judge in Houston, Texas, and had me sectioned. Had me locked up in a psych ward for 72 hours. And I think about, and this is such a common story, especially for white women in this culture. Let's talk about Britney Spears for a second. So, I don't know, there's just an article that came out last week or so from New York Magazine. Have a read, will you? And it talks about the kind of background of Britney Spears, who grew up in southern Louisiana, very close to where my people are, and talks about all the women in Jamie Lynn Spears, her father's family, who had been institutionalized. And it was a way that men in their family just dealt with women, like, "Oh, she's being a problem. I got a solution for you." And in southern Louisiana, they call it going to Mandeville, which is where the state psychiatric institute is. And that was my father's response to that, because, and he also said, "I want to try and stop the publication of that book. There's no way that's coming out." And fortunately, for me, one of my brothers was in Houston and basically got me bailed out, showed up at the hearing on that Monday morning after my 72-hour lockup and went to the hearing with me. And as it turned out, there was somebody there that he knew on the panel that was doing the hearing, and they had been fishing buddies, and so they were like, "You're going to take care of her, right?" And it was a whole Texas thing. Anyway, he was like, "Yeah, she's fine. No need to worry about that." But I think the story about my father and his response is a very typical sort of white patriarchal response, which is in a way analogous to the 911 calls, right? It's calling in the power of the state to say, "Can you handle this unruly person? Can you take care of them? Because I don't want to have this difficult conversation, deal with them anymore. They're bothering me," right? And that's what you have access to when you have access to power in this culture. You have access to the power of the state to rain that power down on someone else's head who's bothering you, right? And that's what my father did.
And if your daughter is writing about white lies in your own family, then, yeah.
Super important to have her locked up.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you, I realized I left my phone, which was a miscalculation because I don't have the clock now, so I'm wondering how we're doing on time. Okay.
We're at 10 to 7, so I think we could take questions from the audience if you want.
Yeah, that sounds great. So does anyone have any questions for Jessie?
And there's a microphone floating around so the people on the recording can hear questions.
And I have more questions if not.
Sure. No pressure.
Yeah.
Here we go.
Did you have a DNA test done to figure out, is that how you know you're not Cherokee?
Well, it's a couple of things. That's a great question, and I appreciate that. You actually can't tell Cherokee heritage from a DNA test because it's not a racial category, it's a tribal category. So part of the way that I figured it out was going through Ancestry.com and looking at there's something called the Dawes rolls, and sort of going through going through the historical records, like the census and that sort of thing, and actually tracing who my father's actual relatives were, it was like, oh no, they came from England. It was just, it's like they're historical documents that show who they were, and so it didn't require a DNA test, and that wouldn't have told me anything anyway. So, great question. Thanks. Other questions? Oh, hey, Phil.
Yes.
Thanks for coming.
Hi, Jessie. I'm Philip Ewell. I'm a professor of music theory at Hunter, and I had the great fortune of having Jessie as a mentor in a writing program about 3-4 years ago.
Before
And
the pandemic.
yeah, thank you for being here. Thanks for this great book. I would
Thanks for
buy a
coming.
copy, but I have it on Kindle already.
okay.
So I just got back from a conference, a big music conference in New Orleans. And literally in the span of 3 days, I had 2 quite famous white musicologists, music theory types, claim Native American ancestry. It was a fascinating thing for me, because I've read the book, and I know I'm just like, wow, I got to go back to the book and kind of remind myself about how this happens. One was in an email right before I went, because I wanted to check the demographic makeup of a book. That was a famous book about LGBTQ musicology stuff going on in the 90s. And I wanted to know if there were any BIPOC there. And I emailed this person, and the person said that I'm part Cherokee. And I know this person well. And I respect there are 3 actors here, and they're all women, I would say at least 70 years old in the field. I do have a question, but it's a very interesting point that I would like to make before the question. With the other case, this was at a panel 2 nights ago. I had been invited by an LGBTQ group, which I myself am cisgender and I'm straight, and I take that as a great point of pride because I'm clearly an ally enough to be invited. And I talked about white agency within the field of musicology. And I was pointing out that, for instance, the first committee in the Society for Music Theory was called the Committee on the Status of Women. And I was very collegially and respectfully saying it really was about white women at that time. And then there was a group for gay folks. They called it Gay and Lesbian Musicology. We of course call it LGBTQ stuff, issues now. Same thing. Everybody was in fact white, and I was just explaining that white agency, exerts itself. And then there was a disability studies group. Well, that can have a bite at the apple because disabled people can also be white, as can queer people, and as can women. There is one group that does not have that agency, and that is, of course, people who are not considered to be white, for however defined, right? Because it's changed a lot. And one person, the one woman there, then also said, well, this person was actually part, and then another Native American. I can't even remember what nation this person was claiming. But I would just say, to finish that part of the story, I would just say there were enough young people in the room who were just kind of like, oh my goodness, really? Are you, it was kind of strange, but it was just a comment, it wasn't a question. The question is related to all of what I just said. And it has to do with the whole idea of Amy Cooper's white feminism. And is there a point at which a white woman who would consider themselves a feminist maybe moves from a healthy form of feminism into an unhealthier form? Are there points at which something happens? Is it generational? Does it happen? Is it territorial, geographic? Or how does the nice white lady phenomenon happen in kind of, is there a point at which it happens?
I feel
Can
like
you
this
point to
is
it?
my fault that I
Thank you.
didn't sort of center this part of the book more, because Jessie talks about the importance of intersectionality and the shallowness of feminism on its own.
Yeah, there's a whole chapter about white feminism, and part of what I argue in that chapter is that there is a way in which, so to answer your question most directly, yeah, every day there's an opportunity for us as white feminists to do the wrong thing. So there's not like a stage development or anything like that I would identify, but I think that, so when I was in graduate school, and this is a story that I tell in the book, that when I was in graduate school, I had a professor, who shall remain nameless, who said, as you're going on the academic job market, it might go easier for you if you grew your hair long, kept, made it really dark, and identified as Native American. Like, that was her suggestion to me. And I'm sure that she, in her mind, thought that she was mentoring me, right? I mean, she was bringing me along. Here you go, this might happen. And it just happened this past week. There was a woman, I can't remember what university she's at, but there was another woman who was an academic who was just identified as like, nope, she's not in the tribe. And that's part of how these pretendians, these people who want to claim Native heritage, are often outed, is because someone who has that tribal identification says, we never heard of you. You know? And so there's this wonderful scholar, Kim Tallbear, who is in Canada, and she says the thing with Native American ancestry, it's not who you claim, it's not the identity that you reach for, it's who claims you, right? And that was the thing that my father was missing, right? Is that there wasn't anyone in the Cherokee Nation who was like, oh yes, come in, our missing son and brother, you know? He was just like, oh, I'll have this. I mean, it's a very American approach, right, to identity. It's the same thing that we do with religion, right? I mean, we in America, and Robert Bellah wrote about this years ago in Habits of the Heart, you know, we in America have a kind of cafeteria approach to religion. Oh, I'll take a little Buddhism and a little Episcopalian and a little Judaism. I'll have one of each, right? And it's kind of what, and that's a very settler colonial approach to otherness, right? You see otherness as something that you can, you know, as bell hooks, right, as spice. Right? Like, oh, I'll just have a little of this to like spice things up. Because going back to the point that Maud was making earlier, there's a kind of emptiness to whiteness. You know, it's like people who were saying that we need to like, you know, figure out what our original heritage was and celebrate that. I don't see that as the path out of this. I think we have to acknowledge that whiteness is in some ways a bill of goods that we've been sold, and there's no there that's anything I want to embrace, you know? And I think that that's part of what the pretendians push is about. And there's a wonderful book by Cirque Strum called Playing Indian, I think. And she talks about these people that she calls race shifters who identify as Native American when they have no, you know, claim to tribal lineage or anything. And she says that they often, what they report is that they find a spiritual emptiness in whiteness, and that's what they're reaching for when they're reaching for Native American identity. So. Question up here? Yeah.
Just picking up on that thought, and I have to apologize, I haven't read either of your books yet, but I'm thrilled to get to read both of them. But in looking at my own family's history and thinking about the void that is whiteness, and the fact that it was, you know, not just created to segregate, separate from enslaved Black folks, but also to attain status, to rise. And there was, you know, all the fighting among white folks for a long time about who got to be the whitest of the white. As you point out with the class conversation that you guys just had, it's still going on. But I think I'm wondering a lot for myself, and I'm curious if the books talk about this. As you were just saying, like, whiteness is not, there's no belonging in whiteness, or there's not a satisfying belonging in whiteness. There's a fantasist belonging in whiteness. But we have an enormous white population who desires belonging in this country. And a lot of, I think, the twisted psychology comes out of that desire for belonging. And so I guess I'm just asking if either of you think in these books about that question of seeking belonging and where people who are white, because there's also the mixed ethnicity. You know, I think a lot of white people looking at their genealogy are like, oh, okay, I'm Italian American, I can cling to that. But the reality is probably they're mixed. I mean, you know, all the Catholics married all the Catholics, you know, et cetera, et cetera. I'll stop there, but.
Yeah. So my book is about a lot of different things. It is about ancestor trouble, which is a very broad category. And so I don't want to misrepresent it as being exclusively focused on the lie of whiteness and the toxicity that lie has brought and the harm that it's brought. But that is a huge part of my background. And, you know, I mean, in my book, I go on a sort of like psychological, imaginative, and ultimately spiritual sort of path. And I have found that very helpful for me for clarity. And I'm not really super invested in whether the spiritual part of it has objective reality. I'm more interested in the ways that it enables me to see more clearly the harms, the negative aspects of my ancestors that I don't want to carry forward, but I do have to acknowledge, and the positive things that I do want to carry forward from them. Because ultimately, from this category of whiteness, we have to find some sort of positive inheritance, right, that allows us to show up in an authentic way, in a way that's not perpetuating harm. Proceeding through life as a vacuum of nothing is dissatisfying and harmful for everyone. And so, yeah, I had some other point to make, but I think we're at time, so I'll stop there.
Yeah, I just wanted to say also that part of the way that I create a community for myself, and I talk about it a little bit in the book, is through queer family. And some of those folks are here tonight. I want to acknowledge them. Les and Francis, thanks for coming. Amanda and Amaya. And queer family is a different way of approaching kinship, and that's a big thing that I think we need to do in this society. And like Maud, I have found the need for a spiritual home, and that for me, that's a queer, multiracial, multi-everything church on the West Side. But the other thing is that I have, part of the thing I gesture to in the conclusion is that white people should be, getting together in groups and talking about racial injustice. And one of the organizations that does that across the country and in New York City is called Showing Up for Racial Justice. So if this is a shout out to everybody, if you're not in Surge, please come join us. I'm on the welcome committee. I'm happy to have you. I'm on the calling in committee. Anyway, there is something about meeting with other people who are doing this work that is actually very sustaining. So after the midterm elections, for example, I was, anxious like everybody else, and I jumped on a call with a bunch of people in Surge, and they went through all the organizing that they have been doing. And so like a lot of the successes that might not have made it to the cable news networks, they were going through like, oh, we organized and we got no in Kentucky passed, and we, all through. And I was like, I felt so great after that. It was like, we're gonna win because we must. So that's what I got for you. And also roller skating. That's my other thing.
I did think of the other thing I wanted to add to that, which is that the Mannahatta Fund,
Yes.
which you're probably all familiar with, but if not, maybe you want to pay your rent to the Mannahatta Fund. But they are an organization that, among other things, offers an FAQ to settler colonialists. And they have a list of things that white people should be doing, settlers should be doing, one of which is acknowledging that we are on the land right now of the Lenape people. But beyond that, something they say that I think can hit a little interestingly if you're a white person is know where your own people came from. And, that's not something that's factually available to everyone. People whose ancestors were stolen from their homelands and brought here in enslavement, are not going to have an easy time necessarily of finding out where their own people came from. People who were adopted, people who are cut off from their roots for whatever reasons. But at the same time, I think it's really worth sitting with that mandate and understanding that the ways in which modernity and white European thought has cut us off from our ancestors in this sense of a continuing relationship and a continuing accountability between the living and the dead. I think that's been really harmful imaginatively, if not spiritually. So.
There's a question back here, if we have just a couple minutes for one.
Yeah, thank you. You were mentioning getting together as white people to talk about racial justice. Isn't that sort of an echo chamber? I mean, how do we, shouldn't this conversation broaden a bit to how
Sure.
we build the bridge
Sure,
to the
absolutely.
people we have historically excluded?
Yeah, absolutely, and that's not the only thing to do, but I think it's an important first step in a way. Absolutely, we need to build cross-racial, cross-everything coalitions to affect real change. But I really think we have got so much work to do on ourselves that we kind of have to connect with other white people around this to sort of get past that first step.
I would also
right.
recommend
Right.
the organization Coming to the Table, which seeks to bridge bring together descendants of enslavers and people who were enslaved in a push toward reparation and a push toward real repair. And there's another organization I've recently become aware of that I really like, called Reparations for Slavery, the number 4. That's their website, and they have a lot of really great suggestions. But Coming to the Table has a lot of community trainings. There's a New York-based group. There's a national group, and so that can be a really good place to start. If you're looking for that connection with, because one thing we don't want to do as white people, right, is go to our Black friends and unburden ourselves about our family history in search of absolution. And so we want to be in connection with people who are Black, people who are Indigenous, people who, are not white, who also want to engage in this dialogue with us. And that can be the benefit of something like Coming to the Table.
Right. So I'm so sorry that Dr. Gelman just left because she is the expert on this. But there's another book that I would recommend to you by Karen Brodkin, a scholar who wrote How the Jews Became White. And part of what the argument that we're both making, I think, is that there is a particular kind of work that whiteness does in the culture, and that has become available to lots of different immigrant populations. It's never available to Black people. And so that is a big distinction, if you will, in whiteness. So it's a much longer conversation. We really actually don't have time for. How are we on time? Can we keep going with questions, or I'm looking at Bianca, who is the.
We're at 10 minutes now, 7:10.
Okay, so we need
We
to
can maybe
end?
take one more.
One more. Okay. How about this lady up here? She's got a microphone.
To say, would you consider white a category? I've always operated on the fact that, as the lady said back there are many versions of white in America. And it's a category that the United States has created, to which Europeans can aspire coming in. If you're Italian, that was the last group over the water bridge, so to speak, at the turn of the century. They were not white until certain markers were hit. The same with the Irish, the same with Jews from Eastern Europe, as well as the Jews, the Sephardic and the Ashkenaz were not treated the same, and they didn't move over that white category bridge at the same time. So I never thought of white as an ethnicity. I thought of it as a status that you had to ascribe to and fit into, and there was a point somewhere along the line where coming from all of these different European groups, you could make it over the bridge. But the rest of us, ain't gonna happen.
Okay. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight. I really, really appreciate it. Thanks to Maude for this conversation, and I hope you'll get both books.
And I really do recommend them.